Well, good morning, CCV. Good to see you. Good to be back. This is one of my favorite churches on the planet, to be honest with you. And your pastor is one of my favorite pastors on the planet, too. Isn't he one of yours? And, it's good to see him up and about. And I know he's fired up about starting the new Christmas series next weekend. And if you're here today, just like for the first time, checking things out, come back next weekend, because I'm just the backup guy. And you're in for a great challenge. Did you have a great Thanksgiving? Good deal. We had a fantastic Thanksgiving at our house. We went to Vegas for Thanksgiving. And, yeah, it's not what you think, actually. My wife's from Vegas, and we were with all her family, and I spent 18 years in Vegas as a pastor there. And the people are always shocked when they hear you're from Vegas as a pastor, and they like, Las Vegas church sounds like an oxymoron, And they're like, what's church like in Las Vegas, Did you have an Elvis impersonator doing a prelude and tithe machines in the church lobby? Or did you have girls in bikinis announcing hymn numbers, And I've always said church in Vegas is like church anywhere else, basically, other than pastors are paid a little differently. Rather than a paycheck once or twice a month, our elder board would call us in every Monday and give us a roll of quarters and wish us luck for the week. And that's not true, so don't repeat that, okay? Hey, today, if you want to grab a Bible, I'm going to be in Ruth, the book of Ruth, chapter 1. That's in the Old Testament. It's a little book. It's hard to find, so I'll give you plenty of time to find it. Ruth, chapter 1. If you were to ask any student pilot what their first big goal is, they would tell you it's flying solo. It's getting behind the controls of that little Cessna airplane or whatever and going through their checklist and running up the RPMs and taking off on that runway and going through their maneuvers and coming back down and touching down, flying solo for the first time. Student pilots would tell you there is nothing like the adrenaline rush, the excitement of flying solo. Now, many of you in this room, you fly solo every day. You're not married. You're single. And for some of you, that's not adrenaline rush. It's exciting. Sometimes it feels very awkward to you in this culture built for two. And if you don't believe this is a culture built for two, let me ask you, when was the last time you ever heard of someone winning an all-expense-paid trip for one? And sometimes when you go through life alone, you feel like a square peg trying to fit into a round hole, and you wonder if you're missing out on God's best for you. Well, friends, let me remind you, the only perfect person to ever live in the history of the world, Jesus Christ, never got married. And so I not only assume that it's okay to be single, I think we ought to, in the family of faith, show that the single life can be every bit as fulfilling and rewarding as married life, just in its own unique way. Now, just to show you how relevant this is for all of us, I did some research this week, and this is going to stagger some of you. This is an unbelievable statistic. You might even want to write this down. I discovered this week that 100% of us will be single for at least some of our life. Now, think about that. Not all of us will be married in our lifetime, but all of us will spend a significant amount of our time not married. And even for many who are married now, one day you will be single again. Because of a death, because of a divorce. I know because it happened to me. Back in the late 80s, I heard those words I never dreamed that I would ever hear when my wife informed me that she was in love and involved with another man, and that she was leaving in the morning, and she did. And despite relentless attempts at reconciliation, she never returned. She married the guy. And suddenly I found myself flying solo again. And as you might guess, the next few chapters were quite difficult for me. And there was a lot of learning and a time for healing. Now, in 1993, I remarried a beautiful woman named Barbara, and we have 3 children, and it's a fantastic era in our lives. But I'll tell you, God used those intervening years in my life to teach me some things about what it means to follow Jesus as a single adult in our culture that I want to share with you today. And I hope that you'll not only listen if you're flying solo, I hope you as a church family will listen, because what I have to share, I think, this subject that we don't talk about very often, can be very relevant toward creating the kind of community at CCV that all people, irregardless of marital status, feel connected and a part of. Now, let me tell you some of the big learnings I had about flying solo. First big learning I had was lots of people fly solo. In fact, 82 million adults in the U.S. are not married. But I quickly found out you can't lump these people into all one big category, unmarried, because they're quite unique from one another. The three main characters in this book of Ruth that we're going to look at today remind us, even though this was written 3,000 years ago, these unmarried people are quite different from one another, and I want to introduce you to these characters. The first main character's name is Naomi, who is an older widow. Years earlier, Naomi and her husband moved from their hometown of Bethlehem. You've heard of Bethlehem. And they moved to the land of Moab, where they had two sons who grew up. The two sons got married. And then Naomi's husband died. And unbelievably, about the same time that her husband died, both of her adult age sons died. Can you imagine that grief, losing your husband and both kids? The second character we meet in this story is Ruth, a young single widow with no children, and she was one of Naomi's daughter-in-laws. And then the third person's name is Boaz. Boaz is a single, middle-aged, wealthy man who apparently had never married. Now, Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz remind us that so many people fly solo that they can't be lumped into one category. For instance, first, like Boaz, there are those among us who have never married. Some have never married because they've been disillusioned by people that they've dated. Some have never married because they've been disillusioned by the relationship between their mom and dad in the home that they grew up in. Some have never married, though they desperately want to be married. They've just never had the right opportunity. It reminds me of the woman who was weeping over a container of ashes, just sobbing. He was my fourth husband, she said. And an older woman who had never married overheard that. She said, she's got husbands to burn and I can't even find one. Now, some people have never married because they've chosen to remain unmarried. Some for a season of their life, some for a lifetime. Now, the second distinct group of those who fly solo are those who have experienced divorce. A number of you know firsthand, like me, that divorce is devastating. Divorce turns your world upside down in so many ways. For instance, how do you relate as now a single person with all your old couple friends? It's awkward. They invite you to go out with them and you complain the whole time, oh, I'm just a fifth wheel, feel like a tag along. And then if you heard they go out without you, you get all bent out of shape about it and have a little pity party for yourself. Even though Ruth was a young widow, I think she experienced many of the adjustments that people who go through a divorce in our day experience. And then the third group of unmarried people are the widows and widowers among us. Like Naomi and Ruth, some of you know what it is to bury the person that you never could have imagined living without. My dad died when I was 14 years old of a heart attack. And I remember a couple weeks after his death, my mom and my brother Greg and I were going to have breakfast out on our patio one morning, and Mom gave the plates to Greg to go set the table, and a moment later, he came back in the house with kind of a sheepish look on his face. She had given him one too many plates. That's hard. And she wept. And maybe you or someone close to you can identify with the grief that Naomi and Ruth had in losing their husbands. You see, lots of people fly solo, and they have diverse needs. Now, a second discovery I made as a single adult is that there are many unique challenges of flying solo. Naomi decided after her husband's death that the best thing for her was to move from Moab back to her hometown of Bethlehem. And her two daughters-in-laws, who had just lost their husbands, were so fond of her that they decided they would go back with her too. And so partway down the road, on the way to Bethlehem, Naomi tries to get them to turn around and go back. And she says to them, this is in Ruth chapter 1, beginning in verse 8, she says, go back to your mother's homes instead of coming with me. Verse 9, may the Lord bless you with the security of another marriage. Naomi was saying to these daughters-in-law, you girls don't need the baggage of your old mother-in-law hanging on. You need a man. You see, Naomi realized that the first challenge of flying solo is loneliness. I'll never forget my first Christmas alone again. We'd had our Christmas Eve services in Vegas, and it was my intent to go grab something to eat at a drive-thru and then go home, do some laundry pack, and I was going to catch an early morning flight on Christmas Day back to the Midwest to spend Christmas with 20 members of my family back there. And I got away from the church late that night. I was starving. It'd been the middle of the day since I'd had anything to eat. So I drove down the street to a little chicken drive-through place, and they were closed. And so then I drove over to Taco Bell, and Taco Bell was closed. And then I went to Jack in the Box. I was really getting desperate. And Jack in the Box was closed. And but I was determined to find something to eat. So I thought, well, I'll go to my supermarket. They're open 24 hours a day. And I went to my supermarket, and they were closed. I had never seen Las Vegas, the city that never sleeps, so quiet. And it was an unusually cold and windy night in Las Vegas, and now I'm starting to feel sorry for myself, thinking about, all the families having their little gatherings on Christmas Eve, and poor me all by myself. But I was determined to find something to eat. So I drove out to the east edge of town to a country western-themed casino called Sam's Town. Yeah, some of you have been there, I can tell. And to my surprise, the place was hopping. And so I go in, I walk through the casino, and there's people playing the slot machines and video poker machines and blackjack tables and all that. And I go up to the second story to a 50-style diner. I sat down at a table for 4 all by myself and ordered the blue plate special. And I remember thinking to myself, this is like a bad dream. I can't believe it. I just spoke for over a couple thousand people, and here I am at Sam's Town on Christmas Eve eating meatloaf and mashed potatoes and gravy alone. And just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, somebody put a quarter in the jukebox, and Elvis started singing in my ear, "Are you lonesome tonight?" Absolutely true. And your sympathy is so touching to me. I'm just so moved. Actually, I sat there and I started laughing to myself, probably to keep from crying. And the thought that just overwhelmed me was, Gene, you are one of the most blessed guys in the world. You have a church family that loves you. You have more close friends than should be legally allowed to have. You're spending Christmas Day tomorrow with 20 members of your family. And if you, of all people, can be lonely tonight, imagine how difficult this night is for those who don't have anybody. And I'm telling you, the Holy Spirit marked me that night. And as I walked out of the casino that was really humming, and watched all these people, the thought that overwhelmed me was, they don't have anywhere else to go tonight either. Why else would they be here on Christmas Eve? Loneliness. Well, after Naomi asked her lonely daughters-in-law to turn around and go back to Moab, one of them decided to do that. Orpah was her name. Isn't that quite a name, Orpah? My wife and I have had 2 daughters. I tried to convince her to name one of them Orpah. I thought Orpah Appel had kind of a nice ring to it. She didn't agree. Orpah took Naomi's advice. She turned around and went home, and Ruth insisted on going with Naomi. And Ruth made a statement to Naomi that you often hear at weddings, and it's a good statement for husbands and wives to make toward one another. But the first time this statement was made, it wasn't made between a husband and wife. It was this daughter-in-law to her mother-in-law. Ruth chapter 1, verse 16. Now, Ruth says, I will go wherever you go and live wherever you live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. I will die where you die and will be buried there. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us. You see, Ruth was also discovering that a second challenge of flying solo is adventure. And I like this. Ruth saw her newfound singleness as a positive opportunity. She says, you know what? I don't have anything tying me down in Moab. I don't have a husband there. I don't have children there. I don't have a job there. I'm free. Let's go. And she goes on this adventure. Ruth didn't lock herself in a room and wallow in self-pity. She began to search for a new adventure in life, even though that was risky. You see, flying solo often allows people much more freedom than they would have otherwise if they were married. They can travel more. They can be available to God for Christian service opportunities. They can go on short-term mission trips. They can mentor a child. They can take financial risk and career risk. This is especially true if you don't have children or if you're an empty nester. I remember when I was single, again, a buddy and I decided we were going to take a vacation to Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, and 3 days later, boom, we were there. Just 3 days, decided to go. There's no way I could pull off something like that. If I went home today and said, honey, guess what? We're going to Puerto Vallarta in 3 days. I'd be single again, friends. I can tell you that right now. There are too many responsibilities and people affected by that spirit of adventure when you're married. Now, once Ruth and Naomi arrived on this adventure in Bethlehem, Ruth went into the fields to work, picking up grain left behind by the farmers there. You say, why did she do that? Because a third challenge of flying solo is kind of a cross between career and finances. Ruth had to go to work. Nobody else was going to support her. And she was determined to find a career for some of the financial needs that she and her mother-in-law had. Now, friends, there is a degree of freedom that unmarried people have in pursuing the fullest extent of their career. They can work late. They can take jobs where they travel extensively. However, especially for single moms and those on fixed incomes, financially making it on one income in our day can be quite a challenge. Studies show that while men experience a 42% rise in standard of living after a divorce, women and children typically experience a 73% decline in standard of living. Ruth went to work picking up leftover grain in the harvest field. Now, that's not a very glamorous job. Today, we might think of it as somebody who pushes a shopping cart along a highway or a sidewalk, and they pick up aluminum cans and glass bottles to make a living. Not very glamorous, but you have to admire this woman who was not afraid to work and had the character and the integrity to go to work. And it was while she was on that job, in that field, that she experienced the fourth challenge of flying solo, dating. Now, for some of you who are single, dating is just a natural part of your life. But for those of you who find yourself single again, it can be really awkward. I remember the first date I had after finding myself single again. I arranged with a gal to go to a movie late on a Friday afternoon, and I told her it would work well with my schedule, but actually I'm cheap and movies were half price in the afternoon. And so I was really nervous. And I wasn't nervous so much about going on a date. I was nervous about being seen in public by people in our church family, just kind of like, ooh, there's Gene, he's with a girl, and that kind of thing. And so we parked in the parking lot, made it through the parking lot unscathed, went into the lobby, got some popcorn, didn't run into anybody, going to the movie theater, and there was one completely empty row, and I said, oh, let's go down there. And so she goes down, and she kind of slips in front of the guy who was, there was one guy on the end of the row, slipped in front of him, goes to this empty row, and then I slip in front of him and go into this row, and just as I'm in front of him, in a big loud voice, he says, "Hey, pastor!" And I was so embarrassed. I turned like 8 shades of red, and I fumbled. Oh, hey, this is my sister, or something like that. I don't know what I said. It was an awful moment. I can tell you that right now. Well, Ruth goes to work in this field, and she gets noticed by the third main character in our story, this guy named Boaz, who was the owner of the field. And the Bible says in Ruth chapter 2, verse 5, then Boaz asked his foreman, and I quote, "Who is that girl over there?" Who is that chick? Now, you need to know Boaz is a great guy. Boaz has character. He's got integrity. He loves God. And he's wealthy. Some of you say, where can I find a guy like that? A gal like that? Well, from what we know about Boaz, I don't think Ruth would have ever run into him at like the traditional meeting spot for singles. The clubs, the meat markets, single bars, those kinds of things. Ruth just did what was right. She kept her act together. And when she least expected it, wasn't even looking for it, God unexpectedly brought this terrific guy into her life. Now, to make a long story short, Boaz befriends Ruth and takes a liking to her. And when her mother-in-law, Naomi, found out what was going on, She said to Ruth, she said, now, I know where Boaz will be tonight, so here's what I want you to do. You bathe, you perfume, you put on your prettiest clothes, and then you go to the barn where he is working, and after he eats and lies down to go to sleep, you go lie down at his feet, and he will tell you what to do from there. You say, what is she telling her to do? It's not what you think. She is telling her to prepare herself as a bride. This is actually like a wedding proposal. Very liberated woman. I mean, she's coming on saying, kind of proposing to him. Saying, I'm available and willing to relocate. Listen as I read what happened next. This is from the Living Bible paraphrase from Ruth chapter 3. Suddenly, around midnight, he wakened and sat up, startled. There was a woman lying at his feet. Who are you? He demanded. It was dark and probably wiping the sleep out of his eyes. It is I, sir, Ruth, she replied. Make me your wife according to God's law, for you are my close relative. Thank God for a girl like you, he exclaimed. I guess so. This is awesome. He said, now don't worry about a thing. I'll handle all the details, for everyone knows what a wonderful person you are. Isn't that a great story? It reminds me of the woman whose husband had died, and she was so distraught that she had inscribed on his tombstone, the light of my life has gone out. 5 years later, she fell in love and got married and didn't know what to do about the tombstone. So she had inscribed underneath it, but I struck a new match. Well, Ruth has struck a new match, and she and Boaz get married. Now, I think this is such a practical story for single people. And let me just draw some quick principles out of it for you for successfully flying solo. The first principle is specifically for those of you who've gone through a divorce or you've buried a spouse. And that is this: be patient while you grieve. Grieving is a process. And all experts will tell you that after a death or a divorce, there's typically a 2-year crazy time in your life until emotional equilibrium gets restored to you. And from my own experience, I concur with that. One of the common mistakes that people often do at a moment like that is to deal with their hurt. They rebound into another relationship. We've all seen this. And almost without exception, those relationships end in disaster. Because nobody can heal your hurt. You see, you need to get healthy and whole and go through your grieving process so that you make good decisions in the future. And then if there are future relationships, you come to that relationship not as a broken person looking for a healer. You come as a healed, whole person capable of making discerning and wise decisions. One man said when he went through his divorce, he said, I chose not to date at all the whole first year because I knew I was so emotionally unstable, I would be vulnerable to the wrong kind of relationship. That's a wise man. Dating and remarriage will not cure your grief, so be patient while you grieve. Second principle for successfully flying solo: learn to be content as a single person. I know some single people who have made themselves miserable thinking they cannot be happy unless they are married. Friends, listen, if you are not a content single person, the chances are very high that you will not be a content married person. While many single people say, oh, I wish I were married, many married people are saying, oh, I wish I were single, right? And the myth is that a change in my status is what's going to make me content, but it is not our marital status that produces contentment. Now, I'm just going to be frank with you. The reason a number of you sense a lack of fulfillment in your life, whether you're married or unmarried, is you have a hole in your soul that can only be filled, that can only be satisfied by seeking God companionship, not human companionship. The Apostle Paul, he was single, and this is what filled the void in his life. He said in Philippians 4:12, he said, I have learned the secret of contentment in every situation. You say, how did he learn to be content even though he was single? He says, I can do everything through Jesus Christ who gives me strength. You see, Jesus, the Son of God, is the one who gives us strength. Because this single man, Jesus, was tempted in every way just as we are. He was tempted to have pity parties for himself. He was tempted sexually as we are. He knew what it was like to be hurt by the unfaithfulness of those close to him. He knew what it was to bury close friends. He also knew how to be completely content, though not married. And friends, as one who has walked alone in his life, I can tell you firsthand that when Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest," he meant it. I mean, you tell me what husband, what wife, what guy, what gal, what boyfriend, what girlfriend can make a promise to you like that and meet the deepest needs at the deepest part of your soul. You've got to have a relationship with Jesus Christ to have those needs met if you want real contentment. And then if you do date, if you do contemplate marriage in your future, you do it from a position of satisfaction rather than desperation. You can be a happy single person. And third, and this is such an important principle if you want to successfully fly solo, and you're probably not going to hear this anywhere else. This goes counterintuitive to the rest of our culture. You won't hear it anywhere else, but maybe other than right here. You need to maintain or reestablish your sexual purity as a single person. Now, Boaz, this middle-aged wealthy guy, he runs so counter to similar single guys today, his age. Imagine this, Boaz and Ruth had no sexual relations until after they were married. What? No way. You're making that up, Gene. That's not true. It can't be possible. I'm not making that up. Now, I know that many people deep down, they want to save sexual intimacy for marriage, but it is so difficult. I remember back when I was single again, we conducted a survey of a group of single adults in our church in Vegas. We asked 33 people who were between the ages of 25 and 35 what their number one temptation was. 27 of 33 people said their number one temptation was sexual temptation. And I was single at the time thinking, I can't imagine what the other 6 put. I think they probably should have put lying as their number one temptation. Now, I know all the rationalizations. Oh, Gene, you don't understand. You know, the temptations are so great today, or we're going to get married anyway, or you can't be expected to control your passions when you're 25 years old, 35 years old, 45 years old, 85 years old, or whatever it is. I've even heard some people say, if we stop the sex, he or she might leave me. And I'd rather live in sin than be alone. Friends, sexual purity is God's will for your life. The Bible says 5 times directly and 23 times indirectly that singles are to abstain from sex until marriage. And I know it's difficult to maintain sexual purity in this era, but it's not impossible. Barbara and I did it. I know many unmarried followers of Jesus Christ who do it and are committed to it, and you can too. And if you think it's too difficult and if you think it's impossible, would you just remember something? It wasn't exactly easy for Jesus to go to a cross to die for you. And he said, if you're not willing to take up your cross and follow me, you're not worthy of being my disciple. And think about it. Do we have any right to ask God to bless our future and to bless future relationships if we are flagrantly disregarding his will and his teaching in this area in our life in the present? Those of you who are single and are committed to maintaining your sexual purity, I cheer you on. Stay at it. Those of you who haven't done it, you can reestablish your sexual purity through the grace of Jesus Christ. You can start today and have a new beginning in that area. Now, one last principle I want to share for successfully flying solo, and that is be cautious about marriage. Friends, marriage is serious business. Somebody said there are 2 things that should never be entered into prematurely. One is embalming, and the other is marriage. Some of you feel pressure to get married, right? Because people keep coming up to you and say, well, why hasn't a terrific guy like you ever gotten married? Why haven't a fantastic gal like you ever gotten married? I heard about a woman who always had that happening to her, and she came up with a classic response. She said, because I have never met a man who is deserving of the great happiness which I would be capable of bringing him. That's telling him. And so when people pressure you, why don't you have a guy, why don't you have a girl? You just tell them to buzz off. In the name of Jesus, tell them to buzz off. And I would just say this, those of you who've been previously married, be especially wise and discerning and cautious about remarriage, because while 30% of first marriages end in divorce, 60% of second marriages end in divorce. Because there's so many complications and pressures now in the second marriage. There's financial pressures. There's his kids. There's her kids. There's their kids. There's former spouses to deal with. And if you do marry, please give yourself wholeheartedly to that relationship and understand that relationship must take precedent over every other relationship, over every other family member, over even your kids. And if you're not willing to make that kind of commitment, you're not ready to be married. I admire Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz because they show us how to successfully fly solo. Boaz, who was single most of his adult life, eventually married a wonderful woman. Ruth, who was married and saw her marriage cut short when she was just a young woman, eventually had a second chance at marriage. And Naomi, who lost her husband, remained unmarried for the rest of her life, but she lived a life with contentment and fulfillment and joy and happiness. And the good news for single people today is you can too. One of my favorite stories, old story, maybe you've heard about a guy who was out for a run one night, and he was just after dark, and he was running through a cemetery, and he inadvertently fell in a freshly dug grave. And so he started to climb out, tried jumping out, but it was so deep he couldn't get out. He yelled for help. Nobody heard him. And he thought, I'm going to have to spend the night here. So he just sat down in a corner, waited till morning. A little bit later that night, another runner came through the cemetery and fell in the same hole. Started trying to jump to get out, and all of a sudden he felt a hand on his shoulder. And then he heard a voice say to him, you can't get out of here. But he did. There are some of you who think you can't be a happy, content, single person, but you can. Through Jesus Christ, you really can. Jesus is the one who can give us the kind of fulfillment that no husband or no wife ever can. Jesus is the one who helps us start over when we failed. Jesus is the one who comforts us when we're broken. Jesus is the one who teaches us how to fly solo and to soar. Let's stand and bow our heads together. God, I thank you for the clear teaching in your word that our contentment and our happiness doesn't depend on our marital status. And I thank you that Jesus meets the deepest needs of our soul for all of us, no matter what our marital status is. God, I thank you for the single people of CCV. And I thank you for what they mean to this church and the ways that they serve in thousands of different ways throughout this church family. This church couldn't even exist without them. I pray for those who are feeling broken today, who are dealing with a newfound singleness in their life. And they need the touch of your Son, the one who brings grace and healing to the broken. And God, I pray that today there would be those who would choose to follow Jesus, who would step out and say, I need the contentment that only he can bring. I need his grace in my life. And I ask it in Jesus' name and for his sake. And everybody said, amen.